One more time.
Assalamu alaikum and welcome to the Mamluks podcast. My name is Sim. Along with me are my co-hosts, Sheikh Amir and Mahin. We're going to skip the long intro and go straight to the show this time. Help us out on patreon.com/the Mamluks. Mahin, go ahead and introduce our new guest or our guest for this evening. We're incredibly excited to host her.
Yeah, mashallah, this sister has accomplished a lot in her young life. Makes us old geezers feel kind of pretty bad. Like, I look at this bio, I'm like, there's really not a lot I've done in my life compared to this already. So Abrar Omeish is our guest today, and she currently serves as a school board member at large in Fairfax County, Virginia, which is, I think, one of the wealthiest counties in America, I want to say. I think I've been out there overseeing a $3 billion budget for 1.2 million constituents right outside of Washington, D.C. She's the first Libyan ever elected in U.S. history and the first Muslim and youngest ever elected in her role, earning 161,000 votes. She has worked as a senior organizer at the Democratic National Committee. And then Abrar has also served as a legal fellow at a human rights and immigration law firm in Northern Virginia and has been a spokeswoman for the hashtag No Muslim Ban Ever campaign. She was most recently a Virginia co-chair for the Bernie Sanders campaign and a Virginia PLEO and Rules Committee member to the Democratic National Convention. She holds a double bachelor's with honors from Yale University. The Yale University. That's not, it's not like spin-off school in New Haven, Connecticut, and is a current dual MPP, was a Master of Public Policy, I want to say. JD, a lot of, which is Juris Doctor. It's a law student for you folks who are unaware of these advanced degrees, and Bloom Fellow at Georgetown University. So Abrar, assalamu alaikum, welcome, and thank you for coming on the show. I know it's been a hectic, over a month for you now? Kind of?
Yeah, pretty much about a month. Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullah. It's a pleasure to be with you guys.
Absolutely.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So I think this started for you on Eid, right? I'm going back to your tweet, and I'll read your tweet back. It's like from Abrar Omeish on Eid. It was a Thursday, I recall. Eid Mubarak. Congrats on 30 days of worship. Hurts my heart to celebrate while Israel kills Palestinians and desecrates the Holy Land right now. Apartheid and colonization were wrong yesterday and will be today, here and there. May justice and truth prevail. Hashtag Eid with Palestine.
SubhanAllah.
For a Muslim, this is a very, this echoes our sentiments, right?
Very, very generic, very non-controversial. We assume that most Muslims, have this sentiment.
Right. So what happened after this tweet, Abrar? Can you just walk us through the story?
Yeah, I mean, to your points, this was a day when it was really difficult to celebrate Eid because we had just, in the last 10 days of Ramadan, as you guys know, seeing, soldiers stomping Al-Aqsa Masjid inside with their shoes on, which to us is obviously really offensive, and shooting at people praying Taraweeh on the holiest nights, right, at the end of the Ramadan. And then having to, wanting to celebrate while knowing that this is going on, and the entire Muslim community globally was feeling that pain and almost a level of hypocrisy, where we're having this joyous occasion, but knowing that we can't really fully celebrate because something else is going on and people are being killed on this holiday. And I mean, with that being said, also keeping in mind that our masajid too, in the Eid sermons, we're sharing these feelings and saying that we have to stand in solidarity, etc. So that's kind of the start of this day. I posted it really early in the AM during, Eid Salah. And then, we went off to brunch. I came home and that's when the phone calls started. I received a number of emails from families, parents who had been supporters of mine for a while and they were expressing confusion. And then I also received a text from an organization that I'd been working with for months in advocacy for faith minorities. And they were kind of trying to figure a way to talk with them and do something about my tweet. And then I even received a call from the school board chair at the time who was talking about, possible board response action, but was essentially expressing that she had heard feedback from a number of folks and had gotten many phone calls from organizations concerned about this and considering it something that was, as they've said, hateful.
And did you consider this a surprise? All these phone calls, did you expect this? Or when you were
I was shocked. Yeah. I mean, I know that anytime you touch this issue, it's sensitive for people. and that's something I've lived with my whole life. I've always known that one day, people are going to try to put me in a corner, call me anti-Semitic, and the Islamophobes are going to come out of the woodwork from left and right to do that, and they're going to capitalize on that moment. So it's not that I hadn't anticipated this eventually in my lifetime, but I definitely was shocked on Eid day. I mean, I was walking in ready to study for an 8-hour exam that I had the next day for law school. It was finals season. And didn't even think about this. I mean, I just told my parents, okay, I can't go to the family function. I just went to Salah. That's all I could do. After brunch, it's over. I'm sitting at my desk. And then I get that phone call. So I was like, oh, why is she calling me? I didn't actually make the connection.
Wow.
Well, so in your community, Northern Virginia is, because we hear about certain cities, certain places in America, like LA, New York City, as being like maybe very, I guess, heavily Jewish, which doesn't necessarily mean Zionist necessarily. I don't want to like make sure we distinguish between Jews and Zionists. What's the demographic Northern Virginia on that, for that front, for that kind of for people who maybe support Israel, or is it something that people aren't really invested in Israel or Zionism, but it's just the rhetoric of anything remotely anti-Semitic is something that's just triggering to folks? Like, how would you assess that in your community?
Yeah, I think it's extremely important, and this is something I credit our Muslim leaders for having done over the years, to make that distinction between Judaism and Zionism, right? That calling out the violence of a state is not the same as promoting anti-Semitism or condemning Jews. Our Jewish brothers and sisters are exactly that. They're our neighbors, they're our friends, they're our siblings in faith. And there is so much that actually brings us together. And on a local level, there have been so many, different interfaith efforts, things like siblings of Salam and Shalom. I mean, on and on with the, interfaith efforts and dialogue that has gone on. So that's just something extremely important to make that distinction. And for me, when I posted this, that was a very clear distinction in my mind. In fact, a lot of Jewish organizations and Jewish FCPS my own constituents, came out expressing that they've similarly felt suppressed, and that they, have had to, it's really complicated for them to navigate their Jewish identity while being critical of Israel. And I heard the same from some rabbis too, locally. So, I mean, that's just something to be very aware of, that, the difference. I mean, when it comes to the community, alhamdulillah, I mean, there's been, as I said, kind of years-long relationships that have been established. As a kid growing up here, I remember engaging in some of these interfaith activities. As a Girl Scout, I remember going to the Muslim-Jewish camporee, things like that.
Did you ever have conversations like that around the Israel and Palestine issue with your Jewish interlocutors?
Yeah, I mean, so Mahin, to your point earlier, yes, it's a demographically very diverse area. Just want to make sure I responded to that as well.
Sure.
Unfortunately, there isn't really data on religion that's collected, and that's part of the challenge. Is at least now as a policymaker, I can see how critical it is that when we fill out forms and when we designate the ways that people identify, that we actually include the vastness of what's out there, because that's how resources are allocated. That's how we think about, who's thriving and who's falling behind. And as policymakers, we make decisions based on that. So there's no data collected on religion. But what we do know is on Eid, for example, you have about 11% of the student body in this county that is absent. And then on Yom Kippur, you'll have like 5% or so who are absent. So that gives you just a sense, maybe, but it's hard to really tell. And a lot of kids show up to school either way, right? But to your point, the other question that was directed at me, I mean, this is actually a moment of reflection for the community. So faith leaders have come together after this tweet to begin saying, you know what, maybe we need to talk about this, because in all of the interfaith work that I've been a part of, or activities, iftars, different events, visits to masajid and synagogues, this has almost been the elephant in the room that nobody touches. We talk about the sisterhood and brotherhood that's there. We talk about, the deep bonds of faith, how we have similar prophets and stories and, values, the same value of al-islah, like of improving the condition of our world is the same as their concept tikkun olam. I mean, there's so much there, right? That brings us together. But this was a topic that we all kind of stayed away from. And I think it was intentional because we didn't want to compromise or risk, right, those bonds. But I think our leaders now have realized the importance of having some of that courage to have those courageous conversations, right? To kind of say, you know what? Our sisterhood and our brotherhood is so much deeper and so much more valuable and infinite than allowing something like a political conflict to divide us. So, hey, let's start talking about that, because we can still see our common humanity beyond that issue. Even though it's existential in a way for the Jewish community, right? I mean, I've come to really appreciate how challenging it can be to have that conversation when it feels there's no other safe place for you in the world. And you know, it's a refuge, especially in the context of the Holocaust. And that's kind of how that identity is internalized, and that narrative shapes how people feel about it. So
why do you think the response has been so harsh as it has been? It just seems like situations like this happen so often, but it seems like, at least from their perspective, they think that you had some kind of a bond or some kind of rapport that you had established with them, and you've achieved some level of support from them. Maybe I'm just guessing here. I don't. Maybe from their perspective.
I was set to be awarded.
Yeah. So they're going to be recognizing you in some capacity and elevating your status to whatever extent. Do you think that it's some kind of revenge that's happening, that, hey, we thought we were cool and you decide to step out of your territory and get into these topics?
In terms of what may have been fueling this, there are a number of things that make this really complicated. So I do think on some level, I do think some of it is genuine hate. Like, I think there is definitely Islamophobia, and that's part of why the Muslim-Jewish dialogue has been so important. It's to try to undo anti-Semitism and Islamophobia in both communities, to humanize one another to each other. So I do think there was a lot less good faith, goodwill, and patience with the situation as a result of that. I don't think that's the only thing at play, though. Kind of similar to what I was sharing just now, you know, the concept from a young age for a lot of Jews is inextricable to their Jewish identity. And that's something in a history of kind of marginalization, expulsion. You know, a lot of Jewish holidays commemorate the saving of Jews from persecution, right? So if you kind of grow up in that context as a marginalized group, it's really hard to kind of reconcile then the role of Israel being on the other side of a conflict, right? Because that doesn't fit with how you perceive yourself and how you perceive your identity in your community. And I don't want to speak for them, but this is what I've come to kind of empathize with and understand. And so I think there was a lot of fear, and fear always is going to drive us, you know, a toxic combination between those who actually are hateful, which are not all, and then those who are fearful of what this could mean for Jews in the U.S., Jews, you know, globally, set off a set of reactions that ultimately led to this, unfortunately, and that kind of made people forget all of what was done for months before that. You know? I've always been a champion and an advocate for equity and inclusion. I've been working with the Jewish community for really long. But like I said, it's also important to recognize that that's not a monolithic response either. That you know, happened to be that particular organization that's also an Israeli lobby. So, you know, I kind of should have always known that we're not going to, both sides, you know, always knew that we were never going to agree on that one issue given their purpose. So this is where another complication comes in, which is like political considerations. I mean, for an Israeli lobby, they are set to honor a Muslim elected, and here they are, you know, having to confront this situation to appease a donor base, if nothing else. They have to kind of distance themselves and use such strong and scathing language to show that that's something they're still committed to.
You know, right now, you've had an incredible day. You talked to us a little bit about the death threats you've been receiving in your family, and all kinds of harassment in whatever capacity. Has this made you reconsider, because a lot of mosques and other institutions around the country are reconsidering their interfaith activities and relationships with their neighbors that they've had since the recent conflict in Palestine. has it given you a pause for thought that, hey, this is really a one-sided debate or a one-sided engagement that's happening where one party wants your entire compromise, and they don't see any ability to find a middle ground. They don't see their way to shut you down is through their own victimization and their own experience that they feel like is their truth, and they have no room for your perspective. So there's a lot of institutions. I know in Houston there's one that's a huge issue right now, that they're completely reevaluating their relationship with their neighbors and the interfaith activities that they have. And I know others are around the country. Have you reconsidered how you would approach interfaith activities in the future?
I think we have to be really cautious, because this is where, I come in kind of in this weird place in the middle where I'm supposed to be a public leader who's bringing both sides to better understand one another and empathize without compromising on the truth and without, backtracking on what our courageous stance is, but really having that empathy and bringing people to understand each other's perspectives. I do think there are distinct kind of lines that we have to be aware of. I would say that, yes, some of the normalization activities are deliberate and are an effort to kind of cover for what is otherwise propagation of unjust narratives and practices. So there are definitely those organizations. And that's where we start to make the distinction between good faith actors and bad faith actors. I mean, when it comes to the Jewish community as a whole, I'll reiterate, those are our brothers and sisters, our siblings in faith. I mean, the same way that we find solidarity with all kinds of groups, there is a shared humanity there, and in fact, even closer bonds. And that's something we have to kind of maintain and keep in mind. And so, insofar as breaking bread together, coming together to understand one another's faiths, and all the activities I kind of mentioned participating in as a kid, those are things we should continue to have and have enriched our community. At the same time, when it comes to this, the topic of Israel in particular, I think on some level we're going to have to agree to disagree as a whole, but to also recognize the nuance within the community, the Jewish community itself.
But I don't think that's enough for them, though. I don't think they want agree to disagree. They want...
And that's what's made this so hard, right? Exactly.
Right. They won't put that aside, even though, I think the Muslim community, at least in the West, has tried to repair or had good relations with their neighbors, the Jewish community in specific. I don't think that's been reciprocated on their end by them, not just this issue, but also it's one thing to just disagree about this issue, but then there's another step you take where you are making an example out of people like Abrar, so that there's other people who don't ever cross them or disagree with them when they engage with them. And it seems like they're setting an example with you by... I
mean, I'll keep it very real. I mean, the same organization that I was, besties, if you will, with, we were talking about how we're going to collaborate together. We were meeting for hours. I mean, I gave hours of my time that I didn't even have really to invest in how we're going to support Jewish families and how we're going to bring these interfaith coalitions together to advance what we were all, hoping for. And that went on for months, as I mentioned. I had multiple Jewish roundtables with faith leaders that were intended to specifically think about how do we make schools a more accommodating place for Jewish students, for Jewish staff. Mm-hmm. So all of that had happened. And the minute this tweet went out, I mean, again, keeping it real here as to what went down, I felt that there was bad faith engagement. After I spent my entire Eid, instead of studying for that exam I'd mentioned, back and forth with this organization, and then crafting that second tweet that I ended up posting that they had approved of, I was ghosted, the next day. And the idea was that we were supposed to craft the language for the retweet together and all that. Absolutely nothing. And then they posted what they did. And even after that, we had been reaching out to them for the RSVP for the roundtable, which had been scheduled prior to this tweet and prior to all this drama. But and they were, ignoring us, and then posted in their article that they had tried to reach out to me multiple times without any follow-up, right? So those are bad faith situations. I mean, I was threatened on the phone. I was yelled at, in ways that were very aggressive. So those are the situations where, all right, we have to be able to differentiate. Who do we believe is a good faith actor? Who can we actually build bridges with, empathize with, and is coming from a place of deep faith and wanting to bring people together with the understanding that we have very clearly different kind of perspectives on this. And it's so hard to even say perspectives because some of this is just, it's the reality on the ground, right? I find it so odd to have to say that it's my perspective that aligns with the Human Rights Watch report or, the facts.
What I want to know is, has anyone combed through the people in their organization and their tweets, seeing if anyone said support for Israel on there? Like, was there an agreement, even if there was like a silent agreement, that hey, we're not going to speak about these issues, having engagements with Muslims or Palestinians and.
But does that even make sense? So, like somebody who's kind of like a lobbyist for Israel, to not mention anything in support for Israel, right?
Because they've normalized support for Israel. Is
why would they agree to that type of condition in the first place? That we're not going to say anything in support for Israel.
Yeah, they wouldn't.
That's what I'm wondering.
I mean, it's
even if they did support it openly.
Abrar mentioned they're openly pro-Israel, the organization, right?
Yeah.
So, like, it would the default is
and I think
Israel
that's what
is
Tim
fine.
is saying. It's almost like again, Abrar, I'm not again. I know you put in a lot of work, but someone who's looking at it from the outside, and these are not your words; these are our words, because I don't want anything to be exacerbated for you of everything that you've already been going through right now. May Allah, first of all, a quick dua for you and your family. Allah protect you and your family and send tranquility in your hearts, and make this a source of your guys' entrance into Jannah without any hisab. And I really mean that. But it almost seems as if somebody who's listening to this now and read a little bit about it, no matter what you would say to be politically correct and just be a good person, forget about political correctness, just to be a good person, no matter what happens, it's one tweet that you would say that's going to cancel out everything, which kind of shows what people's minds were before you even made friends with them, kind of. Do you guys understand what I'm saying?
Yeah.
And I'm not saying what you did all went in vain. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that it's a beautiful thing that you sent out that tweet. I really believe it, because people's true colors were shown, and you did everything by the book. You did everything professionally. You have an awesome track record, right? You did everything the way it was supposed to be done. And you were exercising a very, very important freedom, is when you saw innocent civilians being killed, and that place happens to be in Palestine, and we're celebrating Eid. How is your heart going to be okay with having Eid how are you going to sleep properly without mentioning something about Palestine? So you did absolutely nothing wrong. So my next question for you is, just if I could switch gears a little, is you got a barrage of negativity and some of that stuff we're going to get into detail, inshallah. But when all this was happening, who did you find to be your best in support, and somebody who actually they gave you such support that at least for a time it undermined all the negativity that was coming towards you?
Tough question. I mean, one of the challenges when people kind of look to you for leadership is where you look, for support. I will definitely recognize. I mean, my parents obviously are without question were really there and did their part. Imam Majid, actually, I'm going to call him by name, from Adams Center, really kind of had my back, and we worked together to try to figure a way to build beyond this. And even rabbis, I want to call them, point them out too, because
that's awesome.
There are rabbis who I've worked with that have called Muslim leaders and said that this is absurd. We don't stand by the statement. I can't even believe it's been published. We we never saw it. So there was definitely solidarity from multiple fronts. And of course, advocates who had known me for years, who weren't able to come out publicly. And that's one of the most challenging things about this issue, as we see, right? Who would send me texts or messages saying, look, we've got your back, we're behind you. And, I'd sometimes say, would you, be able to say that publicly? And they'd say, you know what would happen to me if I did, So that's kind of been one of the things that I've heard from folks. But alhamdulillah, I mean, the Muslim community did step up. and I did, I was happy to see that. And of course, most importantly, above all of this, was turning to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. I mean, at the end of the day, I also want to be morally clear. And this is where it's so tricky, because I don't want my pursuit of speaking for justice to then oppress others, even if they happen to be from a perspective that I disagree with.
And somebody who tries to uphold justice like yourself, you're always thinking about that, right? That I want to do something good for somebody, but who else is going to? So it's a very difficult situation to be in, right? You want to help somebody.
We did see spikes in anti-Semitism, and that's a reality, because we've got white supremacists who are after all of us.
Of course. Yes.
So there's that, where it's like, how do I navigate that and make sure that while I need to continue speaking truth, and I'm not going to back down on that, we need to teach truth to kids on these issues, because we currently teach them a skewed perspective.
Of course.
And I have to continue being a voice for that. At the same time, I have to make sure that I'm, like you were saying, not being unjust towards those who I also represent and care for, and who are my neighbors.
It's just something that goes through your mind, right? It's something, it has to go through your mind. Good people, that's how good people think. They want to stand up for someone's justice, but at the same time, they want to make sure that the ramifications of someone else is not at the cost of that, right?
Mm-hmm. Right. And that's where I'm careful also to kind of say they and that, right? Because
of course,
it's not that monolith, right?
Yeah, but you mentioned that there were some rabbis who reached out to you, and people of the same faith who said they don't agree with this, but they can't go out publicly either, because they know how strong that lobby is, or that group of Zionist supporters. They have a very considerable amount of influence in their community, and they can get complete shutdown as well. But
and that doesn't mean that some of them weren't hurt or confused themselves.
Okay.
I mean, some of them did have very honest conversations with me about how they felt, because our lived realities are just so different that this is one of those topics that's very difficult to kind of bridge the gap sometimes. But
how does that conversation go though? Like when you're on a call with them, and how are they explaining to you that they're hurt and confused?
Yeah,
because that word is used around so liberally throughout America. I'm just so hurt and confused. It's so vague, and you don't even know what you're replying to and what people are hurt and confused about when they say that. So I was just kind of wondering what goes on in your mind when someone says, "Well, Abrar, I'm so hurt and confused by what you said." Well, what did you think I believed in?
It's like some kind of like gaslighting almost.
Hostage, holding someone hostage based on something. But go ahead. What does that make you feel like?
I think that's such a good characterization. The gaslighting is such a good characterization, because this was especially the case with my colleagues, where I'm sitting here thinking, okay, so all of them are looking at me as someone who posted this hurtful thing, right? And where do I even begin to unpack to then construct like what I'm trying to share with them? Because the Muslim perspective, and it's not just Muslim, the alternate perspective is just so, there's such a low literacy in understanding it. People have not been exposed to it. It's been so suppressed that we haven't had that discourse as a country even. And now we're finding, a crack kind of where people are beginning to start speaking, right? We see that there are members of Congress who are willing to speak out. Black Lives Matter has elevated it. Bernie Sanders and others have been able to speak to this in a way that's raised some awareness. So we finally see certain terminology being used, for example, right? The Human Rights Watch report that called it apartheid, right? That's really unsettling for people who have seen their existence as inextricable to the concept of Israel.
Yeah.
And so I think that's part of what made it so challenging to navigate, and what makes it so difficult for folks to internalize, even if, our Jewish brothers and sisters are truth seekers, are justice, seekers. They believe in this stuff in their theology, just like we do, right? But I think because of how deeply personal it is, it can be received in ways that a person doesn't know necessarily when they see something like that, where it's coming from. So when I think about people who critique Saudi Arabia, okay, if there was an offensive and Saudi Arabia was doing something or whatever, it would make sense because it's a just stance, right? And I wouldn't disagree with them necessarily. But I also know there are people out there who criticize Saudi Arabia just because they're Islamophobic, right? Mm-hmm. So people come at it from different places. And I think that's what ends up kind of complicating this further, because, for a Jewish person, they don't necessarily know what place that person is coming from. And that's been a tool that's used to marginalize them over time. So for these rabbis, while they can see the distinction, and knowing my record and knowing who I am and knowing, my upbringing, and some of them have known who I am before even I was in public office. So they're able to see. I mean, one of them actually in particular knew me since middle school. So they know that that's not the brand I'm coming, or the angle I'm coming from at it. But I think it's just so familiar to the oppression that does exist and the anti-Semitism that is propagated by those people who are enemies of all of us, that it was a little bit confusing or unsettling to receive.
So like,
and those language of, colonial things or occupation or apartheid,
or
which has only become
settler colonialism, they call it. Yeah, right. So I think one thing that comes to mind is that, like, it seems to me as like an outsider to this, because I'm obviously not as invested. Like, you're right now in the belly of the beast, so to speak, right? We obviously support the Palestinian cause, but we don't have that kind of we don't have the skin in the game right now, as you do, as you've established, right? But when it comes, so to me, it's interesting because I would think objectively it's a life and death matter. It should be pretty clear that people are dying. Like, there's Gaza is an open air prison. I remember, there was Edward Dutton, former guest on our show, a guy out of Finland. He's saying that Gaza is an open air prison. It's terrible. And these are people of European descent who are kind of like distant from the situation. It's kind of like obvious if you look at it objectively. Whereas it's interesting when we have, like, for example, it reminds me of the recent thing when Biden wants to recognize the Armenian genocide, right? And if you talk to a lot of Turks, they have a different way of framing it. They're like, no, this is how it is, that it is, right? But I think, can we get to a human level where we can at least acknowledge that not lives are being lost, no matter whose side it's on? Mm-hmm. Because I think it's all, right. but you're so concerned about, like, and that's a valid concern because people use it as agendas, yeah, right?
Yeah, no, that's things. Exactly right. And those double standards are where you start to see the biases coming out and where they become obvious. So to your point, right? What kinds of things do we call out? It's, at least from the White House, it seems selective. Who do we give aid to, and who do we allow to continue receiving aid and not sanctions, despite their actions? That's, another area where we see some of that. And this is also where I saw, honestly, even in the response from, those in leadership to what happened, where there's almost a selective empathy. I truly feel that I don't know if it's a lack of exposure, but it's certainly compounded by the fact that, if we think about it really, post 9/11, and a lot of the foreign the wars were involved in Iraq, Afghanistan, etc., have been justified by a certain image of what Muslims, Arabs, brown people, that whole mess of whatever they are. All the stereotypes associated with that have been necessary to justify a lot of our own foreign policy agenda, and the surveillance and the funding that's gone to tens of agencies here to continue surveilling masajid and the war on terror. So when I say that, to say that underlying Islamophobia is kind of the baseline of what the average American is operating with. So it's no surprise when a certain response is different. And with the Jewish narrative, I think it's been in this country for longer, for the Judeo-Christian values. There's more of a kinship that's been associated over time through narrative that makes that much more relatable, much closer to home for people, in a way that Islam has been framed as the enemy. So it just positions us very differently to even start the conversation. And you can't empathize with people and see the humanity of people through disagreement when you can barely see it in like a neutral situation, Right. So that's, I think, part of what's complicated. It's just a toxic mix of stereotypes and biases, and implicit and explicit, that position people really differently in how they confront this issue.
Sure. Yeah. So we had Tahir Herzullah from AMP on a few weeks back, from American. Oh yeah. Okay. So, and he is, the Palestinian cause is that's essentially what he does. And on the show we discussed this concept of, and I want to get your take on it as someone who's been involved with the DNC. that Palestine, that we have to almost, that he's suggesting that, I think we discussed it, that Muslims can become single issue voters until this Palestine situation, until this shifts, right? Because right now, that's the most important thing. Like, we can agree, like, that's interestingly enough, most Muslims should be able to agree on that, right? But then, like, you know, and then you've got, I've seen Mashayikh on Twitter say the same thing, you know, recently, people who are mainstream, like, scholars within our community. But, like, how do you, but you've obviously built a relationship, a rapport in politics, you know, public service and that kind of thing. How does someone like you balance that? When you hear that kind of rhetoric, you've got to, and that's why sometimes I'm also try not to be judgmental of certain, I have a friend who actually runs an interfaith organization. He built one. So he spent years building up these relationships, right? And I guess I'm not surprised that he's going to have a soft stance on this issue. You know what I'm saying? He's not going to come out and be like, just condemn it hard, like as someone like, if you're with AMP, because of the work he's done. Some people would be like, well, he's being selfish, he should just let his organization crumble. I don't, because of that. But I mean, like, when you try to think of live in someone's shoes, I just want to get your take. You know, I kind of give you a lot but you follow what I'm getting there. It's like,
I hear you. Yeah. I mean, like, you humanize your way into complacency.
Right.
Yeah. I will say, I still am a believer in some of these interfaith efforts. I had a phase definitely where I was more skeptical and kind of felt like it was, watering down, you know, the reality of these issues. But I think that common humanity is still, I mean, that's part of our faith. That's still something that's extremely important to develop and build and cultivate. And I think there's a humility with it, because as much as we like to think that we can be on the edge and be aggressive advocates, we over time will kind of find ourselves in a rut of dehumanizing the other too. And that's where we come back to, how do you call out what's unjust towards a people without being unjust back to another population, right? Because we will develop biases ourselves the further extreme we allow ourselves to go towards the people, you know, who we may be speaking about, in ways that might take us further than what is just. I'm not saying that we shouldn't be speaking truth to power. We've got to stay, you know, we've got to have lines that we're uncompromising about. The reality is the reality, the facts are the facts, yes. Truth is truth, justice needs to be upheld, no matter who it is, who's perpetuating the injustice, no matter who it's against, you know? But that's where I think the interfaith efforts are essential to allowing us to have that. I cannot imagine what this would have happened. I don't even just mean towards me. I mean for the community, how this would have gone down had there not been deeply established interfaith relationships that can help people have a conversation.
Very true.
You need those leaders who built that trust over time.
Of course.
How would you compare it now? So I'll give you a personal take that I'm gonna, you know, evangelical Christians, right? I've seen more pro-Israeli, more pro-Zionist stuff from evangelical Christians in the last several weeks than anyone who's Jewish, to be honest, right? And, you know, there's and we've always thought about, like, you know, supporting Christian businesses and things like that. So we had a restaurant. So Nini's Deli's opening back up. Nini's Deli in Chicago, right? But the owner of Nini's Deli, I mean, they're Pentecostal Christians. They're pretty evangelical. I've had a good relationship with them, but dude started posting about Israel, like Israel belongs to the Jews, etc., etc. And someone like that, who's like completely divorced, and is just like purely ideological, I don't think that's skin in the game. I'm like, dude, I ain't going to your restaurant because I ain't giving money to a freaking evangelical who's gonna like donate to Zionism. You know what I'm saying? Because I put them in a separate box. Because Abrar talks about like Jews who have been oppressed in their history, the Holocaust, etc., right? But I think the evangelical Christians who are Zionists, I would take a harder line stance with them. Abrar, I want to get your take on it, because we've always like kind of be like, oh well, we share a lot of their conservative values. I'm like, but yo, some of them are the worst when it comes to Zionism.
Yeah, but one thing I know Abrar is going to answer this. One thing you have to remember is what you're speaking on more of an activist level, right? Okay. Abrar is not. She just made a tweet from her heart,
right?
And she wasn't thinking, oh, I'm going to utilize and leverage this position that I'm in. she. If I'm not mistaken, I mean, you wouldn't really consider yourself on that level of activism, which is fine. I mean, like, that's not how we see. We see you more as an academic, somebody who's holding office. But I think what you're saying more on like an activist level of not or almost boycotting something. I don't think she even wants to go there right now. Am I right or wrong?
I certainly wasn't taking that position with my tweet.
Okay.
But what I will say is, there's some people think, certain things are political, certain things are activisty, and they need to be left away from the public arena, or like, a public official shouldn't be engaging in these things.
Mm-hmm.
I don't actually believe in that. I don't know if I subscribe to that distinction. I don't think our lives have those lines, I mean, and it takes tremendous privilege to be able to say,
you're right,
oh, this is too political, I don't touch this,
you're right,
this is for the activists, because you can afford to ignore it. This became so obvious with Black Lives Matter, right? Where I remember, public officials saying, oh, no, we don't want to say that, like, we'll just keep away from that, these are riots, etc. These were some of the backdoor conversations we were having. But Black Lives Matter to a Black person is not a political issue. That's not activism. That is a human rights, reality for their existence. So that's where these things get a little bit complicated. I think it's relative.
Mm-hmm.
And for the Palestinian issue, I mean, that's deeply personal to some of us, right?
Yeah.
Al-Aqsa Masjid is sacred. It's a holy site for us. It's a big deal. So to say that that's a political issue is, again, to have the privilege to be able to afford to ignore the issue. Whereas for some of us, we can't do that. So I just want to be careful, because I think that's usually weaponized against us.
Yes.
The apolitical, let's be neutral, let's be objective, without realizing in reality, our context is not objective or neutral. No such thing exists. In fact, we just, when it aligns with what the majority thinks, we don't feel it as being biased or political, because it's just so normal to us.
Yes.
So that's just something I would offer. And to build on, what Maheen was saying, this is where it's become super complicated, that tweet, which started off as these anti-Semitic attacks against me, has turned into a massive wave of Islamophobia that has nothing to do with where it's even started. And it's this like weird, I don't know if you guys are familiar with Fear Inc., this report that the Center for American Progress came out with, but shows, $57 million industry that propagates Islamophobia, and there is a clear intersection with Zionism there. A lot of these organizations that are, propagating the Zionist agenda are also the ones that are pushing out staunch Islamophobic narrative. And I think that's where the evangelical piece comes in. And it's entirely disingenuous. And I don't think, I certainly know that, Jewish rabbis I work with wouldn't support, though I don't want to speak for them, but certainly wouldn't support the hate that's propagated from them towards any group, including Muslims. And they wouldn't want them to speak for them in the first place. So that's added nuance.
Do you think there is some kind of, using you as someone who is not a Palestinian but as an Arab, and also in Muslims in general, using us as an example to exclude us from politics, from the American discussion based on our views towards the Israeli-Palestinian issue, to show to the various politicians in Washington that have influence, to show to them that, hey, these people, they're all on the Palestinian side. We're not going to be able to get very far with them. Using just situations like you to highlight that, hey, we can't have Muslims, Arabs in these spaces, in politics.
So you're saying it depends who says it, right?
So I'm saying that right now, as by default, the Palestinians will always, in their mind, they're coming from a secular perspective. They don't see our bond, our Islamic bond, and things like that. That's not of much concern to them. But when they can show that, hey, all Arabs, including a Libyan, right, Abrar?
Yeah.
And we're subcontinenters here. We're people who are not very attached to the Palestinians, at least ethnically, or we're not even neighboring them. When they see such a unified stance with the Palestinians, do you think they're kind of leveraging that to prevent us from being allowed into spaces where political discussion takes place, policy is made, things like that. When they can highlight, hey, these people, they're not willing to compromise on this issue.
I actually do. I think over time there's been a concerted effort to make, with a lot of the language of Israel being the strongest ally of the U.S., et cetera, or that, Zionism is inherently a part of being American, that making those things inextricable has led to that, right? Because what does it mean for me to be American and not Zionist when those two things are purportedly inextricable? That's suggesting that I can't be American, or at least not fully American, right? So I definitely think that that's a part of it. And it benefits, of course it benefits them. They are afraid of Islam. I mean, I think there's actually a genuine fear. Certainly I think some of the leadership are well aware that not all of this is true and use it and capitalize on it for all kinds of gain, including political gain. But a lot of the followers are genuinely afraid of what they think is this Sharia boogeyman. It's going to come and usurp the Constitution and bring, behead people and force women to do whatever. I mean, but that kind of scary story, right? I think people genuinely fear that and believe that. And that's a fault of a lot of the media that's been put out deliberately for whatever political gain and financial gain, frankly, for like Fox News and these kinds of outlets that further push people into this corner of believing that reality. I mean, I remember during the campaign, I would visit nursing homes and I would talk to some of the elderly who would tell me, they would watch Fox News and this and that. And they wouldn't necessarily associate me. They wouldn't make the connection mentally that what they're seeing on TV is who's the person in front of them, But they lived in such a different reality where they're sitting there talking to me about the Sharia monster that's coming to usurp the Constitution, But they're seeing the humanity. I mean, they're not making that connection, but because of this alternate reality that has now existed. And we hear about, alternate facts and all of that, right? But that's what we see manifest in these situations and ultimately leads to the inability to have the discourse. And the other thing I'll say about this, there was just a study recently, where they took a pro-Palestinian tweet and they asked people whether it's anti-Semitic. And then they told them who wrote it, right? So the difference between their classification of whether it's anti-Semitic or not drastically increased when they told them it was a tweet from Ilhan. And that's what we're seeing here, right? There are all these stereotypes and assumptions, implicit biases, if not explicit, that people have towards the Muslim Arab brown thing. And they associate that with any commentary about Palestine to further this anti-Semitic thing, which is ultimately anti-American, which ultimately furthers the agenda of white supremacy.
So, Sister Abrar, I know that we've asked you a lot of pressing questions, and I know it's probably not an easy thing revisiting this, but you were talking about the media. We typed in your name in Google, all right? And 2 days ago, what do you have to say for yourself, ma'am? Who is Abrar Omeish? Virginia School Board member urges students to remember jihad.
By the way, before you comment, I noticed the author of this article, it seems there seems to be some weird intersectionality there too.
Yeah,
Anyways.
about that. So
Yeah.
I think this is part of, Muslims, I think, in breaking through to the social justice narrative, we're still on the newer end. I don't know that we've fully become integrated in that. I still feel this way, when we talk about rights of minorities and equity and inclusion. Muslims we tend to forget that, subgroup that's been marginalized, especially post 9/11. So to your point, there are the usual suspects, and we have to, part of our literacy now in becoming a little bit more, and I say this word cautiously, but woke, I guess, or more aware. I know there are pros and cons. We that's a separate conversation.
We're not going to give you a hard
We're
time.
not going to get into that right now.
No.
But in really raising one's own consciousness, understanding, and awareness around these issues, there are the usual suspects, and those are to be expected, and that's part of the Islamophobia network I was referring to earlier, right? So papers like what you just shared, I think, with the Daily Wire, Fox, anything from them, think twice, 3 times, or even I think Daily Mail was the other one. There were several of these papers that the minute I see an article from them, I'm like, all right, uber skepticism right now. I'm going to read this as if it's like a hit piece, And that's essentially what happened. In this speech in particular, I didn't even mention the word jihad in the English. The word jihad literally means struggle in Arabic. there was, I mean, if I was just translate the sentence, I mean, I was reminding students of the struggles they went through over the year. And I wanted that, what I said was, remember the struggle, the details of your struggle and how you overcame it.
Wow.
And then I later said, you overcame the challenges, and you'll do that in your future if you set your mind to it. Graduation message to kind of,
That's all you said, and they quoted jihad?
Yeah. So I
did you say
Spanish
something like
Arabic.
Did you say something like, you guys killed it? And then
No, I didn't, but actually, I don't think I did.
Y'all are the bomb.
Oh my gosh.
Anyways, yeah, so that was the extent of it.
But that reveals such a low level of literacy and understanding these issues, right? Because
That's kind
of course,
messed
the
up.
article didn't even mention that I used Spanish. It was like she used Arabic to do this thing and whatever, because that's also part of the stereotypes that scare people. But yeah, I mean, literally translating the sentence was what caused the issue. And they didn't go to translate the sentence. I don't think they necessarily cared to, and they may have, but they have an agenda in doing this. And that's the piece I don't want people to forget. They're, again, multi-million-dollar industry that literally there are organizations that exist, and all their purpose is to propagate negative narratives about Islam. I'm not even making this up. It sounds so conspiratorial. If I heard someone saying this, I'd think, oh, poor minority, like they just think the world is out to get them. But look it up. I mean, they exist. It's insane.
That's pretty crazy, man. But
what's your advice to other young people? I know, like, the sad thing about this is just seeing how strong you are in the face of all this crazy backlash, but I know that there's going to be a lot of people who will not be so strong, and these kind of situations kind of further prevent them from speaking out or putting tweets out. I know, like, just regular Muslim folk out there who are, part of, established institutions or corporations, people who, they in private they'll be very outspoken with friends and stuff, but they'll never tweet anything out, in support of Palestine or anything even remotely controversial, simply because they don't want to deal with the backlash, have anything happen to their livelihood. What would your recommendation or advice be to them? Because I'm sure many of them, maybe it's us. I mean, who knows?
Yeah.
But what would you?
I mean, we all think twice. We all think twice, including myself. In those last 10 days of Ramadan, when I was seeing all this that was happening, I even felt like I really should say something. I'm gonna get a lot of backlash for it. Why am I staying silent? And that's ultimately what came out in Eid. But what I would say is, at the end of the day, the core has to be pleasing Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. I'm just really we have to come back to that central purpose that is immovable, unchanging, unwavering, and doesn't, time, space, context, public opinion doesn't change that. What is right, what is wrong? And sometimes, especially on this issue, I felt when I was even in it, it's like a vortex of narrative that I'm like, it's so warped. I'm like, wait a minute, what is even true anymore? Like, what is even right? I have to take 10 steps back, go back to my Lord, and just remember, this is straightforward. This is about injustice. I'm going to say what I need to say, And that's what I would really advise people to have, that central core, because the world, people are going to have their opinions left and right. There were times when, again, Black Lives Matter just a year ago was a minority perspective, and all of a sudden George Floyd happens, and everyone shepherds towards this other view now, and now it's cool and woke and whatever. So that's what I would go back to.
Yeah.
But I do think it requires solidarity and a lot of us to do it.
Yeah.
One of us doing it will fall, I could only survive because, alhamdulillah, after I did it, Muslim, a lot of, not even Muslim, but, a lot of my constituents who supported me came out and made that clear.
Yeah.
Abby
Abby Martin had this documentary she did on YouTube where she went and interviewed a lot of people in Israel about their thoughts regarding Palestine, and a few people who came on that program, at least they were former Israeli supporters. They formerly supported Israel. They're Jewish themselves, but they said the narrative that they want out there is that it's confusing, when it's really not. Like, all the Zionist sympathizers or Zionists themselves, they want people just to get lost in the details. And what Abrar said was very profound, that what you see in front of you, you see that oppression right in front of you. That is what you're dealing with. What they want you to get lost in is in the hundreds of years of detail that they feel like, well, it's complicated. Who was here first? Who was not? That all is inconsequential. Right now,
That's
there's
a
oppression
distraction.
happening. Yeah, it's distraction. Even though there's many, Muslims who have come out with, refutations related to why Muslims or Palestinians have a right or have a historical claim on that land. It doesn't matter. Right now, there's oppression, and that's all that matters. And what you see in front of you is what you're dealing with. At least when you see oppression, no matter of what race, religion, ethnicity, when you see it, you say it, and that's it.
Yeah, man.
I mean, yeah, oftentimes, we ask ourselves, what would I have done if I was a German in the Holocaust, a non-Jewish German, right? Or what would I have done if I was alive during slavery? Or, and we think, what side would we have been on? And we also think, it's so egregious. How can humankind do something like that and witness it? But we look at this today, where it's the narrative warp, it's the confusion, it's the fear of loss of your job, your reputation, your whatever, that ultimately enables oppression. So we have to find ways that, even when it's uncomfortable, like, where is that happening right now? Because it's constantly happening in the human world, human reality. It happened in our past. We got to learn from that. So how are we going to engage differently now in ways that aren't going to perpetuate what we now look at as absurd in our history?
So, just on a more like personal level, on a more human level, I mean, you're taking this. I mean, you're rolling with the punches. I think you're taking this really awesome, mashallah. I think you're a very strong person. But the reality is that you're receiving death threats. You said that there are family members of people that are coming after your family. Like, do you have like a protocol? Like, have you considered like protocol for protection? Is that where your mind is? I'm only asking just to know where you are right now. Have you like thought about security, hiring security? Like, what's going through your mind right now?
Yeah, I mean, so this has been going on for several weeks now. I think it really escalated after the graduation speech. That's been like the past 3 days or so. And I'm not gonna lie, I mean, I've been receiving, as you said, hundreds to every inbox I have on social media, email. And what was, what became unsettling, I think, was, as you pointed out, when people had, my personal number, my house number, my brother was harassed on the phone, things like that. I mean, so yeah, I think it's our role too to take the steps necessary to, tie your camel, right, if you will. And so I tried to actually reach out to our county security and everything, but I was told that I should just hire my own, and that they don't provide that, which is not the case that has happened for other people before me. So I just want to point that out. And I'm still looking into that. I don't want to call, bias on it just yet, but that's the reality. But we were able to luckily get some folks, to kind of be around.
MashaAllah.
So, I mean, that is a reality, though, to your point, right? I mean, my threshold for being afraid is...
And I want people to realize what actually, it's not just somebody just saying something and they're under scrutiny. I mean, these are real considerations that you're taking, right?
Yeah.
And
yeah, some of these messages, like literally, people were saying things like, I belong to a white supremacist chapter in XYZ city. My group is planning to drive up to Fairfax and whatever. I mean, they're very specific and explicit things. People are
and
saying.
if I can just say this on air, man, any of you guys in the States who know somebody that owns a security firm or whatever the case is, man, reach out to the sister, man. You know what I'm saying? Do what you got to do.
Well,
I'm being serious.
Bro, when we were young, we would have just gone out and we'd be patrolling your house.
Families,
we would
do it for free.
Goodness,
I swear we would have done it for free.
We would have. That's what
look,
we were
the
like.
KKK has gotten involved, so this has gone
Really?
beyond anything I can imagine. Yeah.
Wait, what do you mean the KKK has gotten involved?
The KKK today they sent letters to the Democratic Party about school board members, a communist school board member.
But isn't the KKK? Aren't they like anti-Zionists? or like
So
anti-Semitic.
that too, which is really bizarre. I wasn't sure how to understand this.
This is their PR ploy to get more
Recruits?
people,
I don't
more
know.
recruits.
To get
But-
Democrats on their side, yeah.
Who knows? Yeah.
But in all seriousness,
Yeah.
I
Yes,
mean,
yes.
I think we have to continue to remember that this is exactly what they want. The reason they're doing this, like the overwhelming majority of these people who are harassing it right now, want me to back down. They want me to be afraid. They want me to say, okay, I'm never going to say this again. So that the next time I think to say anything, I'm going to think twice. You know, they want me to feel like I have to water myself down. And this comes even from my colleagues and people who I would think are pro equity or inclusion, right? Who tell me, you can't keep messing with this. You're bringing us trouble at the school board, or you're bringing us, distractions. But you know what? My response is, this is the cost of Islamophobia. And this is what it means when we don't take racism seriously and when we don't, promote a culture that is zero tolerance for this kind of stuff, because then it becomes a distraction for everyone and it does get in your inboxes and disturb the peace, if you will.
Is
But
there recourse for a threat, by the way? When you get a threat, like let's say somebody hits you on a Twitter DM or something, right? Can you do anything about that? Or is it usually, do we just, what's the recourse? Because that's the kind of world we're living in now. People can threaten somebody just openly.
She
and
said hundreds of threats. That was my next
So-
question. Like,
I'll put my law student hat on for
Sure.
a second.
Okay.
And very clear that I'm a student. Okay, so I don't know enough about this yet. But what I've come to appreciate in the short amount of time I've been in school so far is the law has very little protections when it comes to race specifically. Like to be able to raise a claim, even in our work on the school board, almost everything, our legal counsel is always like, well, it can't be, race can't be the reason. Race can't be this, race can't be that. And so that's something, unfortunately, which is expected, right? Because people who looked like us, who face our challenges, weren't necessarily the ones in power crafting these laws over the many decades and generations of this country, right? So the reality is they haven't put in place the protections that are necessary legally to seek recourse in proper ways on this stuff. I know we have hate crime, recourse. That's a thing. So threats, for example, have to be pretty explicit. What happens is, when I called, someone from the FBI got involved yesterday. So, for them, they want very explicit and specific messages because the general stuff they think is not,
not that much of a
serious
threat.
enough. Yeah, which is part of the problem, right? Because this is a weird kind of hate. I mean, this is not something that is necessarily so familiar to American consciousness. Islamophobia. I mean, threats from the KKK and white supremacist groups about something like saying the word jihad or whatever, which is out of context, but still, it's too unfamiliar to know exactly how serious it is and to believe that it's serious. I mean, just today, this was one of the craziest things to me. I reached out to an elected official who happens to be, let's just say, aligned with the majority when it comes to identity, okay? And he was like, this has happened to me before. Usually it's not a big deal, and usually the threats are fake. This has happened to you before? I'm sorry. Okay, as far as I know, I'm the only Muslim who's been elected in this county, so also, like, you're not a minority. I'm sorry, like, this level of targeted hate is just not, don't tell me that's relatable.
Yeah.
This is a very different animal, but we're treating it like it's just the usual. Public officials get, criticism. They get criticism. Believe me, I've been there on other issues where I get criticism. It's a very different reality.
Of course,
It's
but you've
completely
gotten threatened
different.
with your life too, though, right?
Oh yeah, and multiple messages. I mean, I was today and yesterday. I'm not kidding you when I say.
How is
like,
that not
by the
serious,
minute.
though?
What?
How is that not serious if you get threatened by with your life?
I mean, I think that they maybe take it for granted. I think it's kind of like, we get these hate mail messages. Like I said, when it is a very specific threat, that's when the FBI is like, okay, I need to actually look at this. But there's not, it's so weird because it's like, okay, well, we can't really do much until something happens.
Well, you've seen on a different scale when there's athletes who get death threats. If they miss a field goal and it knocks them into the playoffs or something like that, they'll get death threats. You'll see it on ESPN front page, but there's nothing they can do about it.
Right.
But do they have security too, though?
No. I mean, maybe they can afford it, but not really, because it's like you get arbitrary death threats. And I think they're kind of like, well, stop. The team will put out a statement kind of defending the athlete, right? Or
It's weird, but she's like a public official. And
you know what I'm saying?
stuff
So
too, man,
like, I mean, but I guess I can see the example, like, you know, depending on, you know, because and I wonder if a lot of it is protected under free speech laws. I don't know.
Well, when it does cross a certain line, it's technically considered like hate crime category stuff.
Yeah.
But it's kind of like, okay, how do you track the person down? How credible is this threat? What do you do with it? Since nothing has happened.
Right.
You
Could be
know?
an anonymous
Is it
Twitter
actionable?
troll. Yeah, sometimes you get these bots too, right? They'll just pop up like, I'll get random people tweeting at me, and I was like, I look at their account, like, June 2021 created account through 2 followers. It's like some weird like handle.
Speaking of which,
Yeah.
that's a really good point you brought up, because one of the things people don't realize is the majority of this is people who are being paid. And like they make these accounts. I mean, if you go on my social media, you'll see like some of the same people commenting vile stuff with every post. It's the same people and the same accounts, and they're random accounts that don't have names. So, you know, it's a deliberate effort. And actually, I don't mean to connect it all, but really, there's a whole national movement right now against it's crazy that they even label it this way, but they call it, you know, anti-CRT, critical race theory. And they're trying to kind of say this thing where, you know, our kids are being indoctrinated by the social justice agenda, et cetera. So that is a national movement right now that has all these local kind of offshoots that are doing their work for them against school boards. So that's part of what's wrapped up in all of this. And that's why Fox and the Daily Wire and whatever love this stuff, because they're trying to scare people by using all the stereotypes and racist things they know exist and the Islamophobia to say, this is what happens when you support CRT. There are so many agendas here that are intersecting, and people are like,
okay, I
feeding
feel
off
you,
of the
yeah, because
political-
I'm very anti-CRT, but I don't.
Are you?
I am a huge anti-CRT. That's a discussion.
That's a separate show. But
That-
like,
it's not-
yeah, we cannot have that be said right here without me responding. No, so we're gonna leave it.
But we'll talk about it later. But I know exactly what you're talking about, because there is this overlap of what's happening with, at least with Muslims, at least the Islamophobic narrative overlapping with certain other agendas. What's another thing with regards to the bots and the feedback or the influx of hate messages you've been receiving on Twitter? We've had other guests. Saman Al-Oda's son.
Yeah.
He talked about the same thing.
Yeah.
He came on our show and he told us about these bots that Saudi Arabia or
That's
some
right.
people who are
That's right.
you know, linked to the power brokers over there have been creating all these accounts just to flood your inbox, making you feel like you're being overwhelmed with hate, when it may just be a little computer that's just spitting out accounts.
But the mind
Exactly,
game is
and that's
intense.
where I've come to realize, like, the battle, if you will. Okay, I really shouldn't use this kind of language. What I mean
battles.
is like the challenge, the whatever, the debate. The debate is beyond just like the political arena. It's narrative. It's mental warfare.
Yeah.
I mean, that is what beats you down, right? And that's what leads people to give up, to quit.
Yeah.
This is not easy. And I have so many alternatives in my life that I could pursue. Like I made a sacrifice to do this position, you know, and people think like, oh, she's political. She's trying to like, you know, whatever, like this is for her reputation or like a career. This is not her for, you know, the people, or she's not there for the public interest. But this is me taking a severe pay cut and like, you know, not having mental well-being, etc. And that's what public officials in general face. So that's another piece. Is like
And not just that, you're a visible Muslim. It's not. It's one thing that, you know, someone can take a controversial stance, you know, get some notoriety and clout from it, but then like you're a visible Muslim, and when you're seeing you know, op-eds being written about you, you could just be, you know, I don't want to scare you, but you could be, you know, just doing your normal chores or stuff, grocery shopping or something, and you can encounter hate.
Yeah.
So it's just an unacceptable level of risk and it doesn't make sense that you would purposely throw yourself out there in order to gain some notoriety.
Of course.
Right. And what I think gives, oh no, go ahead.
No, please.
No, what I was going to say is, despite that, one of the things, you know, earlier I talked about the importance of centering oneself in something that's rooted in belief that is beyond what's going on around you, that being Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for me. But there are other pieces realizing that the future is going to be different. You know, things are changing. I mean, when I talk, so while I can get this hate from certain constituents that are older, young people, I mean, the students are incredibly inspired by this. I've been receiving messages from students of all backgrounds.
Yep.
I literally, like, when I'm thinking right now, Black, Asian, white, Jewish even, right? That have expressed strong support and that have said that, you know, this has been inspiring for them, etc., especially at the graduation. It was funny because, you know, they're all hating on it and like putting video clips of kids that are like clapping vigorously in the background. So I'll let that speak for itself. But I say that to say that really it's a matter of time. Yes. That's part of what, you know, I know within a year, again, I'm going to bring the Black Lives Matter thing. Just a year ago, we couldn't have certain conversations about the police in this country. And now all of a sudden everyone gets it. We're going to see the same kinds of shifts in public opinion over time.
Yes. There's one thing I think, just two more things I want to mention to you. I think first and foremost, you mentioned something really beautiful right now, that you have a lot of support from the students and people, younger people. The beautiful thing about speaking the truth is, this is something we see throughout all prophethoods, and we see throughout the Quran, we see through the Hadith, we see just historically. The people around you are going to love that if you speak the truth, right? It's generally authority that's not going to be okay with it, right? Imagine when Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, like the infamous story when he went to Bani Shayban, the commander and the chief and the sheikh of the people of Bani Shayban, for instance, who was a tribe, Al-Muthanna, he said, what you're bringing, he's talking to Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, the message that you're bringing, the reason why I can't follow it right now is because kings don't like the speech that you're talking about right now, right? Kings don't like this, which is why I can't support you, right? And that's a whole other story. So what you're doing, you have to remember, and I think you know this already, things might get easier, they might get a little more difficult, right? But you have to remember, as long as you're speaking the truth, no matter how strong this reality becomes, that is a sign of pleasure of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? The whole world can be against you, but if you have Allah, nothing else matters, right? Yeah. What's the wisdom of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala telling us in the Quran? Even if your parents are against you in your iman and they're people of shirk, right? You still have to obey Allah, but you still be courteous and generous and graceful with your parents too. Meaning that there's going to be a time where a majority of people all around you, sometimes the closest people around you won't support you, but you still have Allah, right? And one surah, there's one verse in Surah Al Imran that reminds me of the people that said الَّذِينَ قَالَ لَهُمُ النَّاسِ, that people came to you and said إِنَّ النَّاسَ قَدْ جَمَعُوا لَكُمْ فَخْشَوْهُمْ, right? That people are gathering against you, so fear them. But what happens to the person? زَادَتْهُمْ إِيمَانًا وَقَالُوا حَسْبُنَا اللَّهُ. Instead of them being fearful, their iman was raised because there was a threat that was made against them. They didn't say, oh my God, what are we going to do? They said, this is exactly what Allah promised me when I speak the truth. So Allah is going to be the only one that's going to benefit me here. So the beautiful, I'm pretty sure you know this, whenever you feel overwhelmed, just remember to say, Hasbunallah wa ni'mal wakil, because that's what Allah tells us to say in the verse. That when people come to you and they try to threaten you, try to scare you, number one thing is your iman is raised, which I think, mashallah, is happening to you because you're talking about this God-centric life. But it's also followed through with professing something with your tongue and your lips by saying, Hasbunallah wa ni'mal wakil, right? I think if you have that, you have the attitude, you have the passion to speak the truth, you're in the position to do so. And inshallah, man, I hope, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala aids you in whatever you do. We're going to try our best. We're not at that level yet of you, at your level yet, where we're speaking the truth at that high of a level, inshallah. But I really, really mean this. Any brothers and sisters that are listening to this, and you could be of any help to this Sister Abrar, please reach out to her. We're going to leave the details, right? Yeah, well,
her Twitter handle will be posted.
Beautiful. So. And you said something about Farhan Khan. I can't remember.
Yeah, so I want to, first of all, as we wrap the show up, shout out to our, one of our longtime supporters, Farhan Khan, who linked us up with, Abrar, we know of your story, like many people in the country did, but he was able to literally connect you with us. Yes. And we it was like logistically really busy, but he kept bird dogging me too. Like, hey man, don't let this one slip too. I want to appreciate him.
May Allah bless him and his family. He really was tremendous and was one of those souls who stood up as well and was willing to speak truth. So
sure,
yeah. Well, folks, thank you for joining us this evening. Abrar, it was a pleasure. We're going to make sure we have you on, and we'll have a little back and forth over. We'll talk about some CRT next time you're.
Oh God.
When all this blows over, we don't want to add more stress to your life.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But Allah bless you for everything you do, man. MashaAllah.
Thank you so much for joining us this evening.
Barakallah fikum. Inshallah. Always
All
need them.
For our listeners, make sure you comment below, leave your thoughts and support for Abrar.
Smash the like button.
Smash that like button. Zionists, you are not allowed to comment in the comment section below. Or
Great, that's exactly what you wanted to hear. Sorry, that was a joke, sister.
No censorship. No censorship.
All right, guys. We'll see y'all next time. Assalamu alaikum.